Jacob's well tragedy. On November the 23rd, 1983, two college students entered Jacob's Well in Texas, unaware they were swimming into one of the deadliest underwater cave systems in America. From the surface, the spring looked harmless. But beneath the crystal clear water lay a series of flooded chambers connected by extremely narrow passages. Several divers had already lost their lives there, yet Richard and Clark decided to explore deeper. Neither of them was trained in cave diving. Their destination was a tiny passage that was so narrow, after passing through the first chambers, they reached a narrow, tight opening that was too small to swim through with a scuba tank. One by one, they removed their tanks and pushed them ahead while squeezing through the narrow gap. That's when everything went wrong. Richard lost contact with his air tank and started suffocating. Seeing his friend struggle, Clark quickly handed over his regulator, forcing the two of them to share a single air supply as they fought to escape the cave. Somehow, they squeezed back through the narrow passage and started swimming toward what they believed was the exit. Then everything went wrong. Clark accidentally led them into a dead-end tunnel that looked almost identical to the real way out. By the time they realized the mistake, their air was nearly gone. With no other option, Clark took one final breath and swam for the surface. Against all odds, he made it out alive. Richard never did. Rescuers later recovered his body from the flooded cave. The tragedy became another reminder of why Jacob's Well is considered one of the most dangerous diving sites in the United States, where a single wrong turn can leave even experienced divers with no way back. Mossdale Cave Incident. On June 24, 1967, a team of 10 experienced cavers entered Mossdale Caverns in England to map and clear some of its deepest passages. The cave was already known for its narrow tunnels and low ceilings. Some parts of the cave were just 18 inches wide and 12 inches high, leaving barely enough room to crawl as a shallow stream flowed beneath them. But the group had explored difficult caves before and expected another routine expedition. After several hours underground, 4 members decided to turn back, while the remaining 6 continued deeper into the cave. Outside, dark clouds began rolling in. At first, the rain didn't seem like a serious problem, but inside the cave, the explorers noticed something alarming. The water level was rising. Realizing the danger, they immediately abandoned their work and started making their way back. The problem was that they were still hours away from the entrance. Meanwhile, the people waiting outside watched floodwater rapidly surround the cave entrance. Within minutes, they knew anyone still underground was in grave danger. Rescue teams were called as heavy rain continued pouring across the area. Deep inside the cave, the trapped cavers climbed into higher passages, hoping the water would stop rising. It never did. Rescuers worked around the clock, pumping thousands of gallons of water out of the cave while forcing fresh air inside, hoping the group had found a chamber where they could survive. But as the floodwater filled the narrow passages, every possible escape route disappeared. When the cave was finally reached, there were no survivors. Sturkfontein Cave Incident. On September 29, 1984, cave explorer Nuno Gomes arrived at South Africa's Sturkfontein Cave with his 2 diving partners, Peter Verhul and Malcolm. Their mission was to map one of the cave's unexplored underwater sections by installing a new guideline that would make future dives much safer. The plan was simple. Nuno would enter the flooded passage first and lay the guideline, while Peter and Malcolm remained behind, assisting him from the entrance. Swimming through the submerged tunnel, Nuno successfully installed a guideline stretching nearly 396 feet to the end of the known passage before safely returning to the surface. With the mission completed, the 3 divers decided to enter the cave together one final time to follow the newly installed guideline and confirm that the entire route had been mapped correctly. After reaching the air chamber at the end of the passage, they turned around and started swimming back toward the entrance. Nuno was leading the group when he suddenly felt Malcolm tapping on his shoulder. Peter was gone. Nuno immediately turned around and found Peter inside a narrow side passage. He signaled him to leave the tunnel and return to the main guideline. Peter followed, and the 3 continued swimming toward the exit. But only a short time later, Peter disappeared again. This time, Nuno and Malcolm believed Peter had chosen another passage that eventually reconnected with the main exit, avoiding one of the tighter squeezes they were using. So, they continued to the surface. But when they climbed out of the cave, Peter was nowhere to be seen. Realizing he was still missing, Nuno and Malcolm grabbed fresh air tanks and immediately went back inside. They searched along the guideline, explored nearby passages, and spent nearly 4 hours looking for their friend. Then another problem made the rescue almost impossible. Movement had stirred up thick layers of silt from the cave floor, reducing visibility to almost zero. With their air running low and no sign of Peter, they had no choice but to abandon the search and call for help. The local fire brigade arrived later that afternoon, but they had little experience with cave diving and could do very little to help. By the evening, police divers took over the operation. Unfortunately, conditions inside the cave had become even worse. The stirred-up silt had turned the water almost completely opaque, making it nearly impossible to navigate. With visibility close to zero, the search was called off for the night. Most rescuers believed they would eventually be recovering a body, not rescuing a survivor. But they were wrong. Peter was still alive. After losing the guideline, he became disoriented inside the cave's complex network of underwater passages. Unable to find the exit, he eventually reached a small air chamber and decided to stay there, hoping rescuers would find him. From time to time, he shined his dive light into the water, praying that someone would notice it. When nobody appeared, he switched the light off to preserve what little battery he had left. He even struck his scuba tank against the rocks, hoping the sound would reach another diver. It never did. Exhausted, Peter eventually fell asleep, losing all sense of time. Rescuers decided to wait for the silt to settle before attempting another search. 7 days later, they returned. Despite another full search of the underwater passages, Peter was still nowhere to be found. Another week passed before divers searched again. By then, Peter had been trapped inside the cave for 14 days. He had lost a significant amount of weight, but he still refused to give up. Believing rescue might never come, he left the small chamber and followed another passage nearly 120 feet into the cave, hoping it would lead to an exit. Instead, it ended at solid rock. With nowhere else to go, Peter walked back to the same chamber and continued waiting for someone to find him. Police continued searching on weekends for several more weeks, but every attempt ended the same way. Eventually, the official search was called off. The dry sections of the cave were reopened, and volunteers began looking for a hidden connection between the dry and flooded parts of the cave. Among those volunteers was Nuno Gomez. After days of exploration, Nuno finally discovered the missing connection. As the team entered the newly connected passage, they noticed something remarkable: a trail of human footprints leading deeper into the cave. Following those footprints, they finally found Peter's body. Beside him was a handwritten message that read, "I love you, Cheryl and Ma." Investigation later revealed that Peter had survived for nearly 3 weeks before dying of starvation. Even more heartbreaking, one earlier search team had come within 100 feet of where Peter had been waiting, but never found him. Floyd Collins incident. In late 1924, cave explorer Floyd Collins discovered Sand Cave in Kentucky. Believing it had the potential to become a major tourist attraction, he reached an agreement with the landowners to receive half of the profits if the cave became successful. Determined to make that happen, Floyd spent the following weeks digging deeper into the cave, searching for a larger chamber that would attract visitors. On January 30th, 1925, his determination turned into disaster. After squeezing through a passage barely 9 inches high, Floyd reached a narrow pit that led to an unexplored chamber. Excited by what he had found, he began climbing back toward the entrance. Then his lantern slipped from his hands. The light shattered, leaving him in complete darkness. As he carefully tried to feel his way out, he accidentally loosened a rock. Seconds later, a much larger boulder crashed onto his left leg, pinning him inside the narrow passage. He was trapped. He shouted for help, but nobody heard him. Nearly 24 hours passed before the landowners returned to the cave and noticed Floyd's coat still hanging outside the entrance. Realizing something was wrong, they entered the cave with 17-year-old Jewel Estes. The passages quickly became too narrow for the two landowners to continue, but Jewel squeezed farther inside alone and finally found Floyd alive. Floyd immediately asked him to bring his brothers for help. Within hours, Marshall Collins, Floyd's brother, and Lee Collins, Floyd's father, arrived and began trying to free him by widening the narrow passage around his trapped leg. But every attempt failed. As news spread, rescuers, engineers, miners, and volunteers poured into Sand Cave. Soon, thousands of spectators surrounded the site, turning the rescue into one of the biggest news stories in America. 4 p.m., Floyd's other brother, Homer, arrived, carrying a heavy sense of guilt. Earlier that morning, Floyd had asked him to come along on the expedition, but Homer had turned down the invitation. After that, he worked tirelessly inside the cave until exhaustion forced him to stop. Frustrated by the growing crowds and constant rumors, his brother Marshall publicly offered a $500,000 reward to anyone who could save Floyd's life. Days passed, but Floyd remained trapped. A reporter named Skeets Miller crawled deep inside the cave to interview Floyd face to face. To make communication easier, an electric light was installed near Floyd, allowing rescuers to monitor his condition while they continued working around the clock. Outside, hundreds of people gathered and lit bonfires to keep warm during the freezing nights. The heat melted the snow above the cave, sending icy water inside the cave, making Floyd's situation even worse. Then, disaster struck. As thousands of people gathered above the cave, the unstable ground began to crack, triggering a collapse that sealed the main rescue passage. The only route rescuers had been using to deliver food, water, and supplies was suddenly cut off. The original route blocked, engineers abandoned that plan and began drilling an entirely new rescue shaft from the surface. For days, crews worked without stopping, blasting and cutting through solid rock in a desperate race against time. At one point, workers reported hearing faint groans from deep below, giving everyone hope that Floyd was still alive. Finally, rescuers broke through to his location, but they were too late. Floyd Collins had died only hours before they reached him. His tragic death shocked the nation and forever changed the way cave rescues were carried out in the United States. Even a century later, Floyd Collins remains one of the most famous cave rescue stories ever recorded.